Millbrook's Central Park looked picture-perfect that Tuesday afternoon, with golden leaves scattered across the walking paths and families enjoying the crisp autumn air. The woman on the weathered wooden bench seemed to blend into the peaceful scene: faded jeans, simple gray sweater, worn sneakers that had seen better days. She was reading a paperback novel when 6-year-old Tommy Miller broke free from his father's grip and sprinted straight toward her. "Please, please, please be my mommy for a day," the boy begged, his small hands clasped together. "Daddy can't wear a dress for the school play, and all the other kids have mommies." David Miller's face flushed crimson as he chased after his son, stammering apologies to this stranger who looked like she had enough problems of her own. But instead of politely declining, she closed her book and smiled. "I'd be honored," she said softly. As Tommy jumped with joy, a silk handkerchief with tiny embroidered flowers slipped from her purse and fluttered to the ground. What David didn't know was that in exactly 24 hours, this decision would change everything he thought he knew about the woman sitting on that park bench. David Miller had always believed that life gave you exactly what you could handle, nothing more, nothing less. At 35, he'd learned to handle quite a bit. 2 years ago, cancer had taken his wife Sarah, leaving him to raise Tommy alone in their small house on Maple Street. The mortgage payments were tight, but his carpentry business kept them afloat, one handcrafted kitchen cabinet at a time. His workshop behind the house smelled of sawdust and wood stain, filled with half-finished projects and dreams that had been put on hold. On the wall hung an acoustic guitar, untouched since Sarah's funeral, its strings gathering dust like forgotten melodies. Tommy had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn streak, but at 6 years old, he carried a loneliness that no child should know. He asked questions about Mommy that David answered as best he could, but lately those questions had turned into wishes. The woman who had just agreed to help a desperate 6-year-old seemed ordinary enough, but there was something in her eyes that suggested depths David couldn't fathom. Emma Sullivan, though she'd only given her first name, had been living in Millbrook for 3 weeks, renting a small apartment above the bakery on Main Street. What the townspeople didn't know was that Emma's phone had been buzzing constantly for days, ignored calls from a Manhattan number that grew more urgent with each passing hour. She'd built Sullivan Technologies from the ground up, turning a small software startup into a multinational corporation worth hundreds of millions. But success had come at a price: panic attacks in boardrooms, sleepless nights haunted by quarterly reports, and a growing sense that she'd lost herself somewhere between the IPO and the latest merger proposal. 3 weeks ago, she'd walked out of her corner office on the 40th floor, telling her assistant she needed a few days to think. As Emma picked up the silk handkerchief from the ground, Tommy's small fingers traced the embroidered flowers. "My mommy used to draw flowers just like these," he whispered, and Emma felt something long frozen inside her chest begin to crack. David cleared his throat, embarrassed by his son's revelations, but Emma looked at him with understanding rather than pity. "Would you like to keep this for now?" she asked Tommy, holding out the handkerchief. "For luck with the school play?" Tommy's face lit up like Christmas morning, and David found himself agreeing to meet Emma at his workshop the next day to discuss the details. The next afternoon, Emma appeared at David's workshop carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the same understated clothes that had become her uniform since arriving in Millbrook. The workshop smelled of pine and possibility, filled with the kind of handcrafted furniture that spoke of patience and skill. "You made all of this?" she asked, genuinely impressed. David nodded, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "It's nothing fancy, just honest work," he said, but Emma could see the artistry in every piece. Tommy burst through the back door like a small tornado, still clutching Emma's handkerchief, and immediately began chattering about the school play. As Tommy showed Emma his collection of toy cars, she found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced in years. There was no agenda here, no board meetings or hostile takeovers, just a little boy who needed someone to listen and a father who was trying his best against impossible odds. "Miss Emma," Tommy said suddenly, "do you know any songs? Mommy used to sing to me before bedtime." Emma glanced at David, who was pretending to be absorbed in sanding a piece of wood, his jaw tight with emotion. "I might know a few," she said carefully. Tommy scrambled over to a cardboard box in the corner and pulled out a crayon drawing of a woman with long hair and a flowing dress, surrounded by flowers that looked remarkably similar to the ones on Emma's handkerchief. David looked up from his work, his eyes meeting Emma's across the cluttered workshop. "Sarah was always humming something," he said quietly. "She had this way of making ordinary moments feel magical." Emma studied the child's drawing, noting the careful attention to detail, the love evident in every crayon stroke. She must have been very special, Emma said, and Tommy nodded vigorously. As the afternoon wore on, Emma helped Tommy practice his lines for the school play, while David worked nearby, stealing glances at this woman who seemed so comfortable in their modest world. When Tommy inevitably grew tired and curled up for a nap on the old couch in the corner, Emma and David found themselves talking in hushed tones about everything and nothing. She asked thoughtful questions about his work, and he found himself opening up in ways that surprised him, sharing stories about Sarah, about the challenges of single parenthood, about dreams that had been shelved but not forgotten. "What about you?" David asked eventually. "What brought you to Millbrook?" Emma's smile faltered almost imperceptibly, and she looked out the workshop window at the golden afternoon light filtering through the trees. "I needed a break from my old life," she said simply. "Sometimes you have to step away to remember who you really are." Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of truth that she'd been avoiding for weeks. As Emma gathered her things to leave, Tommy stirred on the couch and sleepily asked her to sing just one song before she went. Her voice, when it came, was pure and clear, filling the workshop with a melody that seemed to wrap around them like a warm embrace. David felt his breath catch in his throat, not just at the beauty of her singing, but at the way Tommy's face lit up with wonder and contentment. As the last note faded away, Tommy whispered, "That was just like Mommy used to sing," and Emma felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally begin to fall. The elementary school auditorium buzzed with the nervous energy of small children in costume and parents armed with cameras. Tommy stood backstage in his shepherd's outfit, Emma's handkerchief tucked safely in his pocket, practically vibrating with excitement. Emma had arrived early, dressed in a simple blue dress that somehow made her look both elegant and approachable. David watched from the third row as she helped the other children with their lines, patient and encouraging with each nervous performer. The play itself was a charming disaster, as most school productions tend to be, but when Tommy's moment came to deliver his speech about following the star, Emma stood in the wings where he could see her, mouthing the words along with him, her face radiant with pride and encouragement. Tommy delivered his lines flawlessly, his small voice clear and confident, and David felt his heart swell with a mixture of parental pride and gratitude toward this woman who had helped his son shine. After the performance, as families gathered in the lobby for punch and cookies, David noticed how naturally Emma interacted with the other parents, how easily she deflected questions about her background while still being warm and engaging. As they walked home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Tommy between them chattering about the play, David felt a contentment he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. "Thank you," he said quietly as they reached his front gate. "For everything. Tommy hasn't been this happy in a long time." Emma looked down at the boy who was now examining a particularly interesting leaf with intense concentration, and David saw something complicated flicker across her features. "He's a special kid," Emma said softly. "You're raising him well." Saturday arrived with the crisp clarity that only October in New England could provide, and Millbrook's youth soccer fields were alive with the chaos of 6-year-olds chasing a ball with more enthusiasm than skill. Emma arrived carrying a travel mug of coffee and wearing jeans and a sweater that made her look like any other soccer mom. As the game progressed, Emma found herself genuinely invested in the outcome, cheering when Tommy's team scored and commiserating when they fell behind. During halftime, as Tommy and his teammates descended on orange slices and juice boxes like a pack of hungry wolves, Emma and David found themselves sitting side by side in comfortable companionship. "He's got good instincts," Emma observed, and David felt a flush of parental pride. "Sarah always said he was going to be athletic like her side of the family," he said, then paused, surprised by how naturally he'd mentioned his wife. Usually, bringing up Sarah in conversation felt awkward, but with Emma, it felt natural. "Tell me about her," Emma said gently, and David found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in months. Funny anecdotes about Sarah's competitive streak and her terrible cooking, and the way she could make Tommy giggle until he got hiccups. Emma listened with the kind of attention that felt like a gift, asking follow-up questions that showed she was truly engaged. As they walked to the parking lot, Tommy between them rehashing every moment of the game, David noticed a black sedan with tinted windows parked at the far end of the lot. The car seemed out of place among the minivans and SUVs, too formal and expensive for a youth soccer game in small-town Connecticut. Emma noticed it too, her step faltering slightly, and David saw something that looked like fear flicker across her face before she composed herself. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly, and Emma nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Of course," she said. but her voice had lost some of its warmth. As David lifted Tommy into the truck, he glanced back at the black sedan and saw a man in a suit talking on his phone, his attention seemingly focused on their small group. "David," Emma said carefully, "I might need to take a rain check on that ice cream. Something's come up." As she walked away toward the mysterious sedan, David felt the first stirrings of unease. Sunday morning brought an unseasonable warmth to Millbrook, and David decided to take Tommy to the farmer's market in the town square. They were examining a display of gourds when Tommy suddenly tugged on David's sleeve and pointed excitedly toward the coffee stand. "There's Miss Emma," he called out, waving enthusiastically before David could stop him. Emma turned at the sound of her name, and David was struck by how different she looked. Her hair was styled differently, her clothes more polished, and she was talking intently with a man in an expensive suit. Emma's face lit up when she saw Tommy, but David noticed the brightness didn't quite reach her eyes. She said something to the man, who glanced over at David and Tommy with what looked like assessment rather than casual interest, before walking over to greet them. "Hi there, soccer star," she said, ruffling Tommy's hair with familiar affection. Tommy launched into another detailed recap of his goal, and Emma listened with apparent attention, but David could sense her distraction. "Emma," David said quietly, "is everything okay? You seem worried about something." She hesitated, glancing between him and Tommy, and David could see her weighing how much to reveal. "That's my lawyer," she said finally, the word falling between them like a stone into still water. "There are some business matters I need to deal with." Before David could formulate a tactful way to probe further, the lawyer approached their small group. "Emma, we really need to discuss the board's decision," he said without preamble, his tone suggesting barely controlled urgency. "The vote is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and if you're not there..." He trailed off, seeming to notice David and Tommy for the first time. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were with friends." Emma's jaw tightened, and David saw something that looked like resignation flicker across her features. "Marcus, this is David Miller and his son Tommy," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "David, Tommy, this is Marcus Webb." The lawyer extended his hand to David with the kind of firm handshake that spoke of boardrooms and power lunches. "Emma, I'm afraid we really can't wait any longer. The Sullivan Technologies board has been trying to reach you for weeks, and the merger with Hartwell Industries..." "Not here," Emma interrupted sharply, glancing meaningfully at Tommy. David felt the world shift around him as the implications of what he'd just heard began to sink in. Sullivan Technologies, he'd seen the name in business magazines, heard it mentioned on financial news programs. It was a major corporation, the kind of company that made headlines when it sneezed. "Emma," he said slowly, "what's Sullivan Technologies?" The look that passed between Emma and her lawyer was loaded with meaning David couldn't decipher. "It's my company," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on Tommy rather than David. "I'm the CEO." The words hung in the autumn air like leaves waiting to fall, and David felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the woman he'd been growing to care about. Tommy, sensing the sudden tension among the adults, moved closer to his father, clutching the silk handkerchief that had started it all. "Does this mean you have to go away, Miss Emma?" he asked with the direct honesty that only children could manage. Emma knelt down to Tommy's level, her composure cracking as she reached out to touch his cheek. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said, and David could hear the tears she was trying to hold back. Sometimes grown-ups have responsibilities that are very complicated. Marcus cleared his throat impatiently, checking his watch with obvious irritation. "Emma, the board meeting is at 9 a.m. tomorrow. If you're not there to cast your vote, the merger goes through without your input." Emma stood slowly, her eyes meeting David's for the first time since Marcus had arrived. David saw apology there, and regret, and something that might have been love if he wasn't too afraid to believe it. "I should have told you," she said quietly, "about who I am, what I do. I came here to escape all of that, but it followed me anyway." David felt anger and hurt and confusion swirling in his chest. "So what now?" he asked, proud that his voice remained steady. "You go back to your real life and we pretend this never happened?" "It's not like that," Emma said, but her voice lacked conviction, and David could see the doubt in her eyes. Marcus stepped forward, clearly ready to end this emotional scene. "Emma, we need to leave now if we're going to make it back to the city in time for you to prepare for tomorrow's meeting." Tommy tugged on Emma's hand, his small face creased with confusion and the beginning of tears. "But you said you'd help me practice reading this week," he said, and Emma's composure finally shattered completely. She pulled Tommy into a fierce hug, her tears falling freely now, and David felt his own anger dissolve in the face of her obvious pain. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered into Tommy's hair. "I never meant for this to happen." Over Tommy's head, her eyes met David's again, and he saw a desperation there that called to every protective instinct he possessed. "Emma," he said softly, "what do you want? Not what you should do, not what's expected of you, but what do you actually want?" "I have to go," Emma said finally, gently disentangling herself from Tommy's embrace. She pressed the silk handkerchief more firmly into his small hands, as if transferring some essential part of herself to his keeping. "Keep this safe for me, okay?" As she walked away toward the waiting sedan, David felt Tommy's hand slip into his, and they stood together in the middle of the farmer's market, watching Emma disappear back into a world they could never have imagined. The week that followed Emma's departure felt like living underwater, everything muffled and strange, familiar routines performed with mechanical precision, while David's thoughts remained fixed on questions that had no satisfying answers. Tommy asked about Emma daily, his 6-year-old mind unable to process why someone who had seemed so happy with them would simply vanish without explanation. The silk handkerchief became Tommy's most treasured possession, carefully placed on his nightstand each evening. On Thursday evening, as David was cleaning up his tools and preparing to head inside for dinner, Tommy came running into the workshop with an urgency that immediately put David on alert. Daddy, there's a man at the front door who says he needs to talk to you about Miss Emma." Through the screen door, he could see Marcus Webb standing on his front porch, looking considerably less polished than he had at the farmer's market. "Mr. Miller," Marcus said as David opened the door, "I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I need to ask you some questions about Emma Sullivan." David felt his protective instincts flare. "What kind of questions?" David asked carefully. Marcus glanced meaningfully at Tommy, and David got the message. "Tommy, why don't you go wash up for dinner? I'll be inside in a few minutes." "Emma's been missing for 3 days, Marcus said without preamble. "She never showed up for the board meeting on Monday, hasn't answered her phone, and her apartment in the city is empty. The board is in chaos, the merger is in jeopardy, and frankly, I'm worried about her mental state." David felt his stomach drop, concern for Emma warring with confusion about why Marcus had come to him for answers. "She seemed conflicted," David said carefully, "like she was torn between what she wanted to do and what she felt she had to do." Marcus nodded as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. "Emma's been struggling with the company for months," he said, lowering his voice. "Ever since her father died 2 years ago and she inherited controlling interest, she's been talking about wanting a different kind of life. But Sullivan Technologies employs over 5,000 people." "Why are you telling me this?" David asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Marcus studied him with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to reading people for a living. "Because in 3 weeks of knowing you, Emma seemed happier and more at peace than she'd been in 2 years of running a Fortune 500 company. Whatever she found here, it mattered to her." Friday afternoon brought the first real storm of the season to Millbrook, with wind that rattled windows and rain that turned the streets into small rivers. David was working late in his workshop when he heard Tommy calling for him from the house with an urgency that made him drop his tools and run. He found his son standing at the living room window, pointing excitedly at a figure hunched against the storm, making their way slowly up their front walk. Even through the rain and darkness, David recognized Emma's silhouette. He reached the front door just as Emma raised her hand to knock, and for a moment they stared at each other through the glass, both of them dripping wet and uncertain. She looked exhausted, her usually composed appearance replaced by the bedraggled reality of someone who'd been traveling hard and sleeping poorly. David opened the door without hesitation, stepping back to let her into the warmth and light of their home. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, her voice hoarse and shaky. "I know I have no right to just show up like this, but I didn't know where else to go." Tommy appeared at David's side, took one look at Emma's sodden, miserable state, and immediately wrapped his arms around her waist. "Miss Emma," he cried, "I knew you'd come back. I kept your handkerchief safe just like you asked." Emma's composure cracked completely as she knelt down to return Tommy's embrace, her tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. "I missed you so much," she whispered, and David felt his own eyes burning as he watched this reunion he'd hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. "You're freezing," he said gently. "Let me get you some dry clothes and something hot to drink." They sat around David's kitchen table, Emma cupping a mug of hot tea like it was a lifeline, while Tommy showed her every drawing he'd made since she'd been gone. "Marcus came by looking for you," David said eventually. "He was worried." Said you missed some important meetings. Emma's hands tightened around her mug, and she looked down at the tea as if it might contain answers. I've been driving, she said quietly. Just driving and thinking and trying to figure out who I really am when I'm not being who everyone expects me to be. She looked up at David, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I went to see my father's grave, talked to him about the company, about what he would have wanted. I kept looking for some sign, some answer that would tell me what the right choice was. And did you find it? David asked gently. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving between David and Tommy, who was coloring quietly but clearly listening to every word. I found something, she said finally. But I'm not sure it's an answer so much as a question I hadn't thought to ask before. She took a shaky breath. David, I need to tell you something about why I came to Millbrook in the first place. Emma reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers cold despite the hot tea. My father used to bring me here when I was little, she said. Before the company got so big, before everything became about mergers and acquisitions, we had a cabin by the lake, and he'd take me fishing and teach me to identify birds. Some of my happiest childhood memories are from those summers. David felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to click into place. I bought the cabin back 3 months ago, but I hadn't been able to bring myself to actually come here until everything fell apart in New York. I thought maybe if I could reconnect with those memories, I might figure out how to move forward. She looked directly at Tommy. I never expected to meet a little boy who would remind me what it felt like to be needed for something other than business decisions. And I never expected to meet his father, who would show me what it looked like to build a life based on love instead of profit margins. So what happens now? David asked, the question hanging in the air between them like a bridge. Emma squeezed his hand, her touch warm now, grounding. Now I make the hardest decision of my life, she said. And I hope that the people I care about will understand, whatever I choose. Tommy looked up from his coloring, his small face serious. Miss Emma, he said solemnly, my daddy always says that the right choice is usually the one that feels scary but good at the same time. Is that how you feel? Emma's laugh was half sob, and she reached over to ruffle Tommy's hair with her free hand. You know what, sweetheart? That might be the wisest thing anyone said to me in a very long time. The call came at 6:30 the next morning, jarring David awake from the deepest sleep he'd had in weeks. Emma's voice on the other end was steady but strained, and David could hear traffic in the background. David, Tommy had an accident. He fell off his bike on the way to school, and I'm taking him to the emergency room. David's heart stopped, then began racing as he struggled to make sense of what she was saying. I saw it happen from my window, Emma said, her voice tight with controlled panic. He was riding on the sidewalk and hit a patch of wet leaves from last night's storm. He's conscious and talking, but his arm is bent wrong, and he's asking for you. David was dressed and out the door in under 2 minutes, his mind filled with the worst-case scenarios that every parent carries like dormant nightmares. He found Emma in the pediatric emergency room, still wearing yesterday's borrowed clothes, pacing the waiting area with restless energy. When she saw him, her face crumpled with relief, and she fell into his arms without hesitation. He's okay, she said immediately, sensing his panic. The doctor thinks it's just a broken arm, maybe a mild concussion. They're doing x-rays now. David felt his knees go weak with relief, and he held Emma tighter, grateful beyond words that she had been there when Tommy needed help. Thank you, he whispered into her hair. Thank you for being there, for taking care of him. Emma pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with tears she'd been holding back. David, when I saw him fall, when I realized he was hurt and you weren't there, I didn't even think. I just ran. Before she could explain further, a nurse appeared to escort them back to Tommy's cubicle, where their brave little boy was holding court with the medical staff, regaling them with the story of his spectacular crash while sporting a temporary splint and a butterfly bandage over his left eyebrow. Daddy, he called out when he saw David. Miss Emma saved me. She called the ambulance and held my hand and promised you'd come as fast as you could. As the orthopedic surgeon explained the need for surgery to properly set Tommy's fractured radius and ulna, David found himself overwhelmed by the complex logistics of single parenthood in crisis. Emma seemed to read his thoughts, stepping closer to his side and speaking quietly. I can help, she said simply. If you'll let me, I can stay and help take care of him during recovery. The surgery took 2 hours, during which David and Emma sat in the family waiting room drinking terrible coffee and talking carefully. Emma told him about her week away, about conversations with lawyers and board members who were willing to help her restructure her role in the company, about the possibility of stepping back from day-to-day operations while retaining enough control to protect her father's legacy. When the surgeon finally emerged to report that the operation had gone perfectly, and Tommy was asking for Daddy and Miss Emma in recovery, David felt something shift permanently in his understanding of what family could mean. Tommy was groggy from anesthesia but managed a weak smile when he saw them, his left arm now encased in a bright blue cast. "I picked blue because it's Miss Emma's favorite color," he said drowsily. Over the next 3 days, as Tommy recovered from his surgery and adjusted to life with a cast, Emma proved herself to be exactly the kind of partner David had never dared to hope for. She anticipated needs before he recognized them, entertained Tommy with stories and games when he was restless, and somehow managed to make their small house feel more like a home than it had since Sarah's death. On Wednesday evening, as Tommy slept peacefully in his own bed for the first time since the accident, David and Emma found themselves alone on the front porch, sharing a bottle of wine in comfortable silence. "Marcus called today," Emma said eventually. "The board meeting has been postponed indefinitely while they wait for me to make a decision about my future with the company." "And what did you tell him?" David asked carefully. Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the quiet street where Tommy had fallen. "I told him I needed 1 more week," she said finally. "1 more week to be sure about what I'm choosing and why." She turned to look at David, her eyes reflecting the porch light. "David, I need you to understand something. If I stay, if I choose this life with you and Tommy, it's not because I'm running away from responsibility. It's because I've discovered that success means something different than I thought it did." David felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he processed what she was saying. "Emma," he said carefully, "are you sure? Because what we have here, it's not glamorous or sophisticated. It's school plays and soccer games and broken arms and ordinary Tuesday nights." Emma set down her wine glass and turned to face him fully, her expression serious and certain. "David Miller," she said, reaching for his hands, "in the past month, I've felt more challenged and excited and alive than I did in 2 years of mergers and acquisitions. Sitting in that hospital waiting room, knowing that my decision to stay in Millbrook meant I could be there when Tommy needed help, that felt like the most important use of power I'd ever experienced." David leaned forward and kissed her then, soft and careful and full of promises neither of them was quite ready to voice. When they broke apart, Emma rested her forehead against his, and they sat breathing the same air. "1 more week," David said, understanding that she needed time to be certain. "But Emma, I need you to know something too. Whatever you decide, these weeks with you have been the happiest Tommy and I have been since Sarah died." As autumn deepened into the rich colors of late October, Emma made her choice with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally learned to distinguish between what the world expected of her and what her heart required. The decision came not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but in the accumulation of small realizations, the way Tommy's laughter filled spaces in her chest she hadn't known were empty, the way David's steady presence made her feel both protected and free. On a crisp Saturday morning exactly 1 month after she'd first agreed to be Tommy's mommy for a day, Emma stood in David's workshop watching him put the finishing touches on a rocking chair he'd been crafting in secret. Tommy sat nearby, his cast now covered in signatures from classmates, carefully sorting screws with serious concentration. "It's beautiful," she said, running her hand along the chair's armrest, and David looked up with shy pride. "It's for you," he said simply. "I started it the week after we met, before I knew who you really were or whether you'd stay. I just knew I wanted to build something that would last." Emma felt tears she didn't try to hide, moved not just by the gift but by what it represented David's faith in their future even when everything seemed uncertain. That afternoon, Emma made 2 phone calls that would reshape the trajectory of her life. The first was to Marcus, informing him that she was stepping down as CEO of Sullivan Technologies but would retain her position on the board of directors. The second call was to a real estate agent in New York, instructing her to sell Emma's Manhattan penthouse. Marcus took the news with resigned acceptance, and Emma suspected he might even be relieved. By Thanksgiving, Emma's integration into their small family felt as natural as breathing. She'd learned to make Tommy's favorite pancakes exactly the way he liked them, had mastered the art of bedtime story voices, and had developed her own relationship with each of David's regular customers. The holiday itself was a quiet affair, just the 3 of them around David's small dining table, but it felt more abundant than any elaborate corporate celebration Emma had ever attended. Tommy said grace with the solemnity of a child who understood that gratitude was important, thanking God for his healing arm, for his daddy's cooking, and for Miss Emma who came to live with us and makes everything better." David added his own thanks for second chances and unexpected blessings, and when it was Emma's turn, she found herself too moved to speak for several seconds. "I'm grateful," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion, "for a little boy who taught me that being needed is more important than being successful, and for his father who showed me that home isn't a place you come from, but a choice you make every day." As winter settled over Millbrook like a familiar blanket, Emma discovered rhythms and traditions she'd never experienced in her previous life. She learned the art of snow day entertainment, became expert at building elaborate blanket forts when school was canceled. She accompanied David to Tommy's basketball games, cheering with genuine enthusiasm. The corporate world didn't disappear entirely. There were still monthly board meetings, quarterly reports to review, but these responsibilities felt manageable when balanced against the daily satisfactions of family life. One evening in December, as they decorated their Christmas tree with an eclectic mixture of ornaments that told the story of their blended life, David realized that he'd stopped thinking of Emma as someone who had joined his existing family and started thinking of the three of them as something entirely new, a family that couldn't have existed without each of its members. Tommy had been asleep for hours when David and Emma found themselves alone in the living room, surrounded by the warm glow of Christmas lights and comfortable debris of domestic happiness. Emma was curled against David's side on the couch, her head on his shoulder, both of them too content to move despite the late hour. "David," she said quietly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if Tommy hadn't run up to me in the park that day?" David considered the question, running his fingers through Emma's hair with absent tenderness. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I think about how brave he was, how he saw something he needed, and went after it without worrying about whether it was appropriate or logical. Maybe 6-year-olds know something about taking chances that adults forget." Emma tilted her head to look at him, her eyes reflecting the twinkling lights of their tree. "He got his courage from you," she said. "You raised him to believe that good things were possible, that people were generally kind. That's not something you can teach, it's something you have to model every single day." "And you said yes," David pointed out. "A complete stranger's child ran up to you with an impossible request, and instead of politely declining like any sensible person would have done, you said yes." Emma was quiet for a moment, remembering that Tuesday afternoon that had changed everything. "I think I said yes because I was already falling in love," she said softly. "Not with you, I didn't even know you yet, but with the idea of being needed for something real." David felt his chest tighten with emotion, struck by the realization that their love story had begun not with romantic attraction, but with Emma's response to his son's need. "Emma," he said, his voice rough with feelings too large for words, "I need you to know that what we have, it's not about convenience or even just love. It's about choosing each other every day, choosing this life even when it's ordinary or difficult. You didn't just save Tommy and me from loneliness. You taught us what it looks like to be a family where everyone belongs completely." Emma sat up so she could look at him directly, her hands framing his face with gentle reverence. "David Miller," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "6 months ago I thought success meant controlling everything, having all the answers, never showing weakness. But you and Tommy have taught me that real success is showing up every day for the people you love, being willing to be vulnerable and human. You've taught me that home isn't something you achieve, it's something you create, one ordinary day at a time." They kissed then, soft and deep and full of promises that didn't need to be spoken aloud, surrounded by the quiet magic of Christmas lights and the sleeping presence of the little boy who had brought them together by asking for exactly what he needed. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the quiet celebration of Emma's first full year as part of their family. Tommy, now 7 and having long since had his cast removed, had grown 3 inches and developed a gap-toothed grin that made him look even more like his father. On a warm Saturday morning in April, exactly 1 year after Emma had first agreed to be mommy for a day, David found himself standing in the same spot in Central Park where Tommy had first approached Emma. Emma looked up from her book as David approached, her smile as automatic and genuine as sunrise, and David felt the same flutter of amazement that had become a constant presence in his life. "What are you thinking about?" Emma asked, patting the bench beside her in invitation. David sat down and took her hand, intertwining their fingers with easy intimacy. "I was thinking about something Tommy said yesterday," he said, watching their son navigate the monkey bars with determined concentration. "He told me that when he grows up, he wants to be the kind of daddy who builds things with his hands and the kind of person who makes people feel at home when they're lost. He said he learned that from watching us." Emma squeezed David's hand, her eyes bright with the kind of tears that come from joy rather than sadness. "He's going to be an amazing man," she said softly. "He already is an amazing little boy." As they sat together in comfortable silence, David realized that the guitar hanging on his workshop wall had started singing again, not just when he played it in the evenings, but metaphorically, in the way that instruments do when they're part of a life filled with music worth making. "Tommy," Emma called out as their son completed his conquest of the jungle gym, "come tell us about your next adventure." Tommy ran toward them, his face bright with happiness, but instead of launching into a story about his playground conquests, he surprised them both by climbing onto the bench and wrapping his small arms around both of them simultaneously. "I don't need another adventure right now," he said with the wisdom that sometimes emerged from his 7-year-old perspective. "I like this one we're already having." David and Emma exchanged a look over Tommy's head, one of those silent conversations that couples develop when they've learned to read each other's thoughts without words. In that moment, sitting on a weathered park bench with spring sunshine warming their faces, they both understood that this was what happiness looked like. Emma reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Actually, Tommy, I have something for you. Something to mark our anniversary." Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a new silk handkerchief, not identical to the original, but clearly from the same family, with tiny embroidered flowers that caught the morning light. "This one is yours to keep," Emma said softly, helping Tommy unfold the delicate fabric. "Not because you need it, but because sometimes it's nice to have something beautiful that reminds you of important moments." Tommy held the handkerchief up to the light, studying the intricate needlework with serious attention. "It's just like the first one," he said wonderingly, "but different. Like how our family is like other families, but also special in our own way." David felt his throat tighten with emotion at his son's observation, struck once again by Tommy's ability to articulate truths that adults struggled to express. "That's exactly right," he said, pulling both Tommy and Emma closer. "We're like other families, but we're also uniquely ours." As they finally gathered their things to head home for lunch, Tommy carefully tucking his new handkerchief into his pocket, Emma slipped her hand into David's and squeezed gently. "Thank you," she said simply, and when David raised his eyebrows in question, she gestured around them at the park, at Tommy skipping ahead of them on the path, at the ordinary beauty of their Saturday morning routine. "For letting me stay. For making room in your life for someone who didn't know she was looking for home until she found it." David stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his hands framing her face with reverence. "Emma Sullivan," he said, using her full name with the formality of someone making an important declaration. "You didn't just find room in our life. You became the reason our life makes sense. You didn't join our family. You completed it." They kissed there on the path, surrounded by the sound of Tommy's laughter, as he discovered something fascinating in the grass nearby, and David tasted salt from tears he hadn't realized Emma was crying. "I love you," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of promises and gratitude and amazement that such happiness was possible. "I love our life, our family, our ordinary, extraordinary days." "I love you too," David replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "All of you, the CEO and the woman who reads bedtime stories, the sophisticated executive, and the person who makes pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. I love every version of yourself that you've trusted me to see." Tommy appeared at their side then, tugging on both their hands with the impatience of someone who had been very patient but was now ready to move on. "Come on," he said with authority. "Let's go home and make lunch, and then we can work on the treehouse, and maybe Miss Emma can sing that song about the mockingbird while we work." And so they did, walking hand in hand down the familiar streets of Millbrook, three people who had discovered that the most profound adventures often began with the simplest requests, and that sometimes the greatest love stories were the ones that felt less like fairy tales and more like coming home.